The night was January 26, 1970. Outside, the neon glow of Las Vegas cut through the desert darkness like a knife. Inside the International Hotel, everything was about power and presence. 800 people sat in the showroom, packed shoulder to shoulder in tuxedos and evening gowns. The chandeliers hung from the ceiling like captured stars. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of expensive liquor and perfume. This was the epicenter of entertainment in America, the place where legends came to prove they were still legends. The opening night crowd was stellar. Among the faces in the audience sat Dean Martin, one of the few men in the entertainment world who truly understood what it meant to command a room without saying anything at all. Ringo Starr was there too, along with Juliette Prowse, Zsa Zsa Gabor, and a collection of Hollywood's most powerful players. But there was only one reason anyone had come that night. There was only one reason anyone had waited months to get these tickets, called the hotel 1,000 times, stood in line at dawn. Elvis Presley was coming back to the stage. For years, Elvis had been locked away in Hollywood, grinding out forgettable movies while Colonel Parker counted the money. Movie after movie, the same tired scripts, the same tired plots. But something had changed. Something inside Elvis had awakened. He wanted to prove that he was still the king, not just in memory, not just in history books, but right now. On this stage, in front of these people. When Elvis walked onto that stage, the response was immediate but controlled. The audience applauded. Some of the younger women shrieked with excitement, but there was something different about this crowd. These weren't screaming teenagers anymore. These were adults, sophisticated people who had seen everything. They had come to be convinced, not to worship blindly. They had come to see if Elvis Presley was still worth their time. What happened over the next 2 hours would become the stuff of legend. Elvis performed song after song, hitting notes that reminded everyone why he had earned the title of king in the first place. He moved across that stage with a controlled grace, with a presence that filled every corner of the room. He sang the old hits, the new material, and everything in between. And with every song, the audience came more and more alive. But there was a moment that night that nobody expected. There was a moment that would later become one of the most discussed and debated moments in the history of their complicated relationship. Elvis saw Dean Martin sitting at ringside. He saw his idol, the man who had influenced his music, the man he had admired since he was a teenager learning to sing. And Elvis made a decision. He made a decision that would tell everyone in that room exactly how he felt about Dean Martin. Elvis launched into a song that he had never before performed live in Vegas. He sang Everybody Loves Somebody Sometime, Dean Martin's signature song, the song that had knocked the Beatles off the #1 spot just 6 years earlier, the song that belonged to Dean Martin, that carried his name and his style and his unmistakable personality all through its verses and choruses. Elvis sang it with a confidence that could only come from someone who had internalized every note, every pause, every subtle inflection. He sang it as a tribute, but he also sang it as a statement. The room went completely silent. Everyone understood what was happening. Elvis wasn't just singing another man's song. He was acknowledging his debt, his respect, his admiration. He was performing a moment of genuine connection with the man sitting at ringside watching him. In Nick Tosha's definitive biography of Dean Martin, published years later, he wrote that Elvis sang that song in Dean's honor. He wrote it as if it was one of the most important moments of the entire evening. He wrote about it because he understood that Elvis, despite being the biggest star in the world, despite being the king of rock and roll, was still capable of showing respect and gratitude to the people who had influenced him. The connection between Elvis Presley and Dean Martin ran deep, much deeper than most people understood. It went back to the very beginning, to the days when Elvis was just learning who he wanted to be as an artist. In 1953, Elvis walked into the studio at Sun Records in Memphis. He was a shy, nervous kid from Tupelo, Mississippi. He had a voice that he wasn't sure about, a style that he hadn't figured out yet. and a burning desire to be something more than ordinary. Marion Keisker was the office manager at Sun Records, the woman who would later famously discover Elvis on tape and insist that Sam Phillips listen to him. When Elvis came in for that early audition, Marion was struck by something. Elvis wanted to run through his repertoire, to show Sam Phillips what he could do, and when he did, Marion realized something that shocked her. Elvis sounded like he was trying to sound like Dean Martin. Think about that for a moment. The king of rock and roll, the man who would go on to revolutionize music forever, started out wanting to sound like a crooner from Ohio. He wanted to capture that smooth, sophisticated style that Dean Martin had perfected. He wanted that effortless cool, that ability to make millions of people feel like he was singing directly to them, personally, intimately. Elvis couldn't find that in rock and roll because rock and roll hadn't been invented yet, so he looked to the men who were already doing it, and Dean Martin was at the top of that list. When Elvis began recording his early hits, the influence of Dean Martin was unmistakable to anyone who cared to listen. Take Don't Be Cruel, which Elvis always said was his favorite recording that he made. Listen to that descending bass run that comes at the end of each phrase. That came directly from Dean Martin's Memories Are Made of This, a massive hit from 1955. Listen to that smooth, almost liquid quality to Elvis's voice, that wobbly, hiccuping baritone that hadn't yet become identifiably rock and roll. That came from Dean Martin, too. The only thing that was uniquely Elvis was the intensity, the raw emotional power that he brought to those musical elements. He took what Dean Martin had perfected and he made it his own. He made it dangerous. He made it revolutionary. But Elvis never forgot where he got those ideas. Even when he became bigger than Dean Martin, even when he had eclipsed his idol in every measure of commercial success and cultural impact, Elvis remembered. He remembered the man who had shown him how to sing with style, with sophistication, with a kind of masculine sexuality that didn't need to scream or show off to be effective. Years later, when Elvis was introduced to Dean Martin's daughter, Dina, he said something that revealed everything about how he truly felt about her father. Dina had met Elvis at some function in Hollywood. They had been introduced formally, the way people in the entertainment world did things. And when Elvis heard her last name, when he understood who her father was, he leaned in close to her and said words that would stay with her for the rest of her life. "They call me the king of rock and roll," Elvis told her. "But your dad is the king of cool." Dina later recalled that moment with awe and disbelief. "I almost died," she said. "It has to be true. Elvis Presley thinks my dad is the king of cool." That statement told you everything you needed to know about how Elvis really saw the landscape of entertainment, about where he placed himself and where he placed Dean Martin. In the grand scheme of things, he wasn't threatened by Dean Martin. He wasn't competitive about it. He was genuinely acknowledging something that he had always believed to be true. Dean Martin had a kind of cool, an effortless sophistication that Elvis recognized as being in a completely different category than anything he could do. Elvis was passionate, intense, revolutionary, but Dean Martin was cool in a way that transcended all of that. Dean Martin made being successful look easy. He made being famous look like it was something he did almost as an afterthought, while he was really just trying to have a good time. But here's the thing that most people didn't understand about Elvis and Dean Martin. They weren't rivals. They weren't competitors in the way that the entertainment industry likes to frame these relationships. They were actually part of a continuum, a progression of entertainment that ran through Las Vegas and through the heart of American popular culture in the middle of the 20th century. Frank Sinatra had pioneered a certain kind of suave, sophisticated entertainment. Dean Martin had taken that and made it his own, adding his own sense of humor and his own sense of ease to the formula. And Elvis had taken everything that he had learned from men like Dean Martin and had transformed it into something completely different, something that would change music and entertainment forever. The moment at the International Hotel on January 26, 1970 was significant because it was Elvis showing everyone that he understood this continuum. He was showing that even though he had become the biggest star in the world, even though he had transcended the categories that Dean Martin occupied, he still respected where he came from. He still respected the man who had shown him the way. When he sang "Everybody Loves Somebody Sometime" with Dean Martin sitting at ringside, he was acknowledging a debt that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. There's a photograph from that night, or at least there are accounts from people who were there, of Dean Martin's reaction. The king of cool, the man who had perfected the art of looking like everything amused him, the man who could deflate any tense moment with a joke or a perfectly timed line, sat there watching Elvis sing his signature song. And in that moment, there was genuine emotion, there was genuine respect, there was an acknowledgement passing between two of the greatest entertainers of the 20th century that went beyond words, beyond the conventional language of the entertainment world. Elvis didn't win that night because he was louder than Dean Martin or because he had more energy. Elvis won that night, if winning even meant anything in that context, because he had the wisdom to acknowledge where he came from, because he had the maturity to recognize that being the king didn't mean you had to forget about the men who had helped you become the king in the first place. The story between Elvis and Dean Martin is a story that gets lost in the mythology of rock and roll. Rock and roll mythology wants to tell you that Elvis appeared out of nowhere, that he invented everything from scratch, that he was completely original and revolutionary and had no debts to anyone else. But that's not how art works. That's not how music works. Every great artist builds on what came before. Every revolutionary stands on the shoulders of the people who made the way possible for them. Dean Martin made the way possible for Elvis by showing him that you could be sexy without being crude, that you could be powerful without being loud, that you could command a room with presence and style and a little bit of humor. He showed Elvis how to be a professional entertainer, not just a musician or a performer, but an entertainer in the full sense of the word. Someone who understood that entertainment was about giving people an experience, about making them feel something, about connecting with them on a human level. When Elvis sang that song, when he made that choice in front of 800 people, when he decided to honor the man who had influenced him so deeply, he was doing something that many artists never do. He was being generous with his success. He was acknowledging that greatness doesn't have to be competitive, that you can be the best at what you do while still respecting the people who came before you. The relationship between Elvis and Dean Martin was never what the tabloids wanted it to be. It was never a story of rivalry or tension or competition. It was a story of respect, of mutual admiration between two men who understood show business on a level that very few people ever could. They lived in different lanes of entertainment. They sang different kinds of music. They appealed to different audiences in many ways. But they understood each other on a level that went beyond all of that. Years of decline lay ahead for both of them. Dean Martin would spend his later years coasting on his reputation, making television appearances and performing in Vegas, but his real creative fire had dimmed. Elvis would struggle with the weight of his own fame, would become increasingly isolated, would be surrounded by people who wanted to control him or exploit him. Both of them would know loneliness and frustration, and the particular kind of hell that comes from being a legend while you're still alive, still trying to be a human being. But what happened on January 26, 1970, was a moment where two men acknowledged each other across the gulf that separated them, acknowledged the connection that had shaped both of their lives. When Elvis sang "Everybody Loves Somebody Sometime" that night, he sang it for Dean Martin. He sang it because he wanted everyone in that room to understand that this man, Dean Martin, was important to him, that this man had mattered, that this man had shown him how to become who he was going to become, and that even though he had surpassed him, even though his name would go down in history as one of the most important figures in 20th century entertainment, he would always remember where he learned to sing. He would always remember Dean Martin, the king of cool, the man who had taught him that it was possible to be powerful and be cool at the same time, to be successful and be human at the same time, to be a legend and still have some part of yourself that belonged just to you. The music played on that night. The crowd watched and listened and understood, at least for a moment, that they were witnessing something more than just entertainment. They were witnessing an acknowledgement of the invisible threads that connect all artists, all performers, all creators. They were watching one giant show gratitude to another giant quietly, simply, through the medium that both of them understood best, through a song. But that moment on stage, singing that song for Dean Martin, was only the beginning of a much deeper and more complicated story. It was the public acknowledgement of a private connection that ran through both of their lives like a thread of gold and shadow, binding them together in ways that neither man fully understood at the time. What happened after that night, what happened in the months and years that followed, would reveal something about both Elvis Presley and Dean Martin that the world wasn't quite ready to understand. Behind closed doors, away from the spotlights and the applause and the carefully constructed public images, both of these men were struggling with something far more difficult than any technical challenge on a stage could ever be. They were both struggling with the weight of their own success. They were both struggling with the isolation that came from being at the absolute top of the entertainment world, and they both understood in ways that only two men who had lived that experience could understand exactly what the other was going through. Elvis had been back in Las Vegas for less than a year at this point. In August 1969, he had returned to perform live for the first time in nearly a decade. The comeback had been trumpeted in all the papers, celebrated by fans and critics alike. Here was the king, they said, reclaiming his throne, showing that he was still the greatest entertainer on the planet. What they didn't say, what they couldn't see because Elvis was careful to hide it, was how terrifying it all was, how much doubt he was carrying with him onto that stage every single night, how much he questioned whether he still had what it took, whether audiences would still respond to him the way they had in the 1950s. During that first engagement in August 1969, Elvis drew over 100,000 people, who paid over $1.5 million in ticket receipts. It was a staggering success by any measure, but success, as Elvis was learning, was a complicated thing. Success meant that people expected more from you. Success meant that the pressure never stopped. Success meant that you had to keep delivering, night after night, show after show, never letting anyone see the cracks in the facade. By the time 1970 rolled around, Elvis was performing in 2 shows a night at the International Hotel. He was doing opening shows and midnight shows. He was performing at peak physical and vocal condition in front of 2,000 people at a time. Twice a day, multiple days a week. It was an exhausting schedule, the kind of schedule that would wear down even the strongest performer. And Elvis wasn't wearing down just from the schedule. He was wearing down from the pressure. He was wearing down from the drugs that had begun to creep into his life, medications prescribed by his personal physician that were supposed to help him sleep, help him stay awake, help him manage the physical and emotional toll of being Elvis Presley in 1970. Dean Martin understood that pressure in ways that very few people could understand it. He had lived through it himself. He had been at the top of the entertainment world. He had performed in front of millions of people. He had been Frank Sinatra's partner, had been part of the Rat Pack, had been a movie star and a television star, and a nightclub performer all at the same time. But there was a crucial difference between Elvis and Dean Martin. Dean Martin had learned how to make it look easy. He had learned how to perform at the top level while still maintaining some part of himself that was separate from the performance. He had learned how to be cool, and cool meant that nothing could touch you, that nothing could get beneath the surface, that you could maintain a kind of distance between yourself and the world. Elvis had never learned that trick. Elvis was too intense for that. Elvis was too invested in every performance, every song, every moment on stage. Elvis gave everything he had, and that meant that everything he had got used up. It meant that every night on stage took something out of him. It meant that the machine that was Elvis Presley, the marketing juggernaut, the cultural icon, the product, was grinding away at the human being underneath it all. In January 1970, during that second engagement at the International Hotel, Elvis and Dean Martin found themselves in close proximity again. This time, it wasn't just a moment on stage, a brief acknowledgement of mutual respect. This time, there was an opportunity for a deeper conversation. The story of what happened between them during this period, the details of their interaction, has been passed down through various accounts and memoirs. Some of it is documented, some of it is recounted by people who were there, but all of it points to the same basic truth. Both men recognized something in each other. Both men saw themselves reflected in the other. There are accounts from people who were close to Elvis during this period that say Elvis became fascinated with Dean Martin, that he would ask people about Dean, that he would talk about how Dean managed to do what he did without seeming to struggle with it. Jerry Schilling, who was one of Elvis's closest friends and members of his inner circle, known as the Memphis Mafia, gave interviews later in his life about Elvis's state of mind during the Vegas years. He talked about how Elvis would say things like, "That man knows something he ain't tellin'." What was Elvis talking about? What was he trying to understand about Dean Martin? The answer might be simpler than it appears on the surface. Dean Martin knew how to survive in the entertainment world without letting it destroy you. Dean Martin had found a way to maintain his humanity while being completely successful, to keep some part of himself private and protected, while also being willing to perform and entertain millions of people. That was what Elvis was desperately trying to figure out. That was what Elvis needed to learn. How to be successful and still be human. How to be a star and still have a self. How to give everything you had to your audience without losing everything in the process. The problem was that it was already too late for Elvis. He had spent the last 13 years locked away in Hollywood, making movies that nobody watched, while his original instinct to perform live, to connect with an audience, had been slowly dying inside him. He had spent 13 years being molded and shaped by Colonel Parker into a product that could be controlled and managed and exploited. He had spent 13 years not really being himself, and when he finally got the chance to come back and perform live, he discovered something terrifying. He discovered that he had changed. He discovered that the human being underneath all the success had been damaged by the experience. But there was still something of the old Elvis left. There was still something of the man who had walked into Sun Records in 1953 wanting to sound like Dean Martin. And Dean Martin, the actual Dean Martin, the legend who had inspired that young man, was in the audience, watching it all happen. He was watching Elvis try to find his way back to himself. And Dean understood, because he was trying to find his way to himself, too. The 1970s were a difficult decade for Dean Martin. By that point in his life, he had already begun to struggle with the things that would eventually define his later years. Depression and alcoholism, which had always lurked beneath the surface of his carefully constructed public image, were becoming increasingly difficult to hide. The drinking that had started as a joke, as part of his stage persona with the cocktail glass always in his hand, had become something far more serious. It was a way to manage the pain. It was a way to manage the pressure. It was a way to manage the disconnect between the public image of Dean Martin, the king of cool, and the private reality of the man himself. Dean Martin's first marriage to Betty McDonald had ended largely because of his drinking, because of the way his addiction to alcohol had poisoned the relationship. By 1970, he was on his third marriage, to Catherine Hahn. But the marriage was struggling. His relationships with his children from his first marriage were strained. The cost of maintaining the public image while dealing with the private reality was growing more and more expensive, in every sense of the word. What Dean Martin had learned to do, what he had perfected over the course of his career, was to mask all of that. He would go on stage and be the king of cool, the man who had everything figured out, the man who drank and smoked and never seemed to care about anything, who could make you laugh while he was falling apart inside. And that performance, that facade, was so perfect that almost nobody saw through it. Almost nobody understood what was really happening behind that smile. But Elvis was beginning to understand. Elvis, in his own struggling way, was beginning to see something in Dean Martin that went beyond the public image. He was beginning to understand that the cool, the effortlessness, the ease with which Dean seemed to move through the world might be a mask. It might be a very effective mask. There are accounts from people who were with both Elvis and Dean Martin during the early 70s that speak to this growing connection between them. They talk about late-night conversations. They talk about moments of genuine intimacy in private spaces, away from the demands of the public and the press. They talk about two men who recognized in each other a kind of suffering that couldn't be fixed or cured, only endured and maybe, if you were lucky, shared with someone else who understood it. The Dean Martin Show, his television variety program, was still on the air during this period. It had premiered in 1965 and would continue running until 1974. Each week, Dean would perform songs, do comedy bits, interact with guest stars, all while maintaining that perfect veneer of cool. The show was incredibly successful, often ranking in the top 10 in the Nielsen rating. It was on Thursday nights at 10 o'clock, and millions of Americans would tune in to watch Dean Martin do his thing. But what nobody could see, what the camera never revealed, was what it cost Dean to do that show every single week. What nobody could understand was the energy required to maintain that level of performance while managing depression and alcoholism and all the private pain that came with being one of the most famous men in the world. Elvis knew, though. Elvis was beginning to understand that cost because he was paying it himself. In early 1970, Elvis released If I Can Dream as a single, followed shortly by the album From Elvis in Memphis, which featured some of his strongest vocal performances in years. The album was a landmark in his career, a demonstration that he could still record meaningful, interesting music without the constraints of the movie studio system. He was experimenting with different styles, different arrangements, working with producer Chips Moman, who had a different vision of what Elvis could do as an artist. And part of what was driving that energy, that creative renewal, was his interaction with Dean Martin. Not directly, not through any formal collaboration or discussion, but through the kind of influence that one artist can have on another simply by existing, by being present, by demonstrating a particular way of approaching the craft of entertainment. Elvis didn't want to be cool in the Dean Martin way. That wasn't who he was. He was too passionate, too intense, too invested in the emotional truth of what he was singing. But he wanted to learn from Dean Martin how to survive the experience of being Elvis Presley. He wanted to learn how to continue performing at the highest level without completely destroying himself in the process. He wanted to learn how to keep some part of himself alive and human and whole while also giving everything to the craft. The problem, of course, was that Elvis didn't have the temperament for that kind of distance. Elvis didn't know how to put that kind of boundary between his public and private selves. Elvis was all in, all the time. He believed that to really connect with an audience, you had to put everything into it. You had to be vulnerable. You had to be willing to expose yourself emotionally. That was what made his performances so powerful. That was what made him the king. But it was also what was slowly destroying him. Dean Martin, by contrast, had learned early on that you couldn't let the audience touch the core of who you were. You could give them a performance. You could entertain them, you could move them and make them laugh and make them feel something, but you had to keep something back. You had to protect some part of yourself. That was the difference between the king of cool and the king of rock and roll. It was the difference between distance and intensity. It was the difference between surviving and burning out. And yet, by the early 1970s, both men were struggling. Elvis was struggling with the pressure of his comeback, with the doubts about whether he could sustain it, with the drugs that were beginning to accumulate in his system because his personal physician, Dr. Nick, was willing to prescribe anything Elvis asked for in order to keep him performing and earning money for the Colonel. Dean Martin was struggling with depression and alcoholism, with the weight of maintaining an image that was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain, with the knowledge that his best years were probably behind him. What these two men had in common, what drew them together in a way that transcended the normal boundaries of the entertainment industry, was an understanding of what it felt like to be at the top and to be slowly dying inside. They understood what it meant to have everything the world could offer and to feel like you had nothing. They understood the particular kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people all the time. They understood what it meant to smile for the camera and to go home to a life that was falling apart. The public never really saw this connection. The public saw Elvis as the king, as the eternal youth, as the man who would remain vital and relevant forever. The public saw Dean Martin as the king of cool, as the man who had everything figured out, who knew how to live the good life without worrying about consequences. But behind closed doors, both men were wrestling with demons. Both men were trying to figure out how to keep going. Both men were looking for answers that might never come. What happened between them during these years, the moments of genuine connection and understanding, would become part of the largely untold history of the Vegas era. It would become a story that people close to both men would carry with them for the rest of their lives. It would become a story that revealed something true about both of these legendary entertainers that didn't fit neatly into the mythology that had been built around them. By 1975, the reality of what was happening to Elvis had become impossible to ignore. His weight had begun to fluctuate dramatically. His face had become puffy and bloated. The black dye in his hair, which he had been using to maintain that youthful appearance, seemed to sit atop a head that looked increasingly older, increasingly worn down. But worse than any of these physical changes was something that people who worked with him noticed in his eyes. The light was starting to go out. The spark that had always been there, the vital energy that had powered him through 18 years of constant performance, was beginning to dim. During one of his 1976 performances at the Las Vegas Hilton, which was what the International Hotel had been renamed, Elvis performed a song called Hurt. It was a simple song, a ballad about emotional pain and the dissolution of a relationship. But when Elvis sang it during that particular show, according to multiple accounts from people who were there, it became something more than a song. It became a confession. It became a statement about what was happening to him internally. He sang it with a vulnerability that was almost shocking. He sang it as if he was singing directly from the place inside himself that was breaking apart. And when it was over, there was a silence in the room that lasted for several seconds. The audience didn't know quite what to do. They had come to see Elvis the King, the triumphant performer, the man who conquered everything. Instead, they had witnessed Elvis the human being, exposed and suffering, and trying desperately to communicate something that he couldn't say in words. It was during this same period that Dean Martin's own decline was becoming more and more apparent. The Dean Martin Celebrity Roast series, which had started in 1974, had become his primary vehicle for performing. Instead of doing the full television show that had consumed so much of his time and energy, Dean would now host these roasts at the MGM Grand Hotel in Las Vegas. They were taping events, which meant he didn't have to maintain the same level of intensity that a weekly live broadcast required. But even so, the effort was clearly taxing him. In February 1976, Dean himself was roasted. Don Rickles served as roast master, and the evening featured some of the greatest entertainers in the world. John Wayne was there, James Stewart was there, Gene Kelly, Bob Hope, Muhammad Ali. All of them came to take their turns at the microphone, making jokes at Dean's expense, ribbing him about his drinking, his age, his career, and Dean sat there, looking increasingly tired, increasingly worn, smiling that smile that had made him famous, but which seemed now like it was taking every ounce of strength he had left to maintain. People who were close to Dean during this period would later recall that something had shifted inside him. The drinking had always been part of his image, but now it was becoming harder to hide that it was more than an image. It was becoming harder to hide that the cool was cracking. The facade that he had built so carefully over so many years was beginning to show its age, and Dean knew it. He knew what was happening to him. He knew that the magic, the thing that had made him special, was fading. There's an account passed down through people who worked with both men of a moment that occurred sometime in the middle of 1976. Elvis and Dean Martin found themselves at the same place at the same time in Las Vegas. The exact circumstances are unclear, but the story that emerged suggests that they ran into each other at a hotel or backstage at some event. They were alone, or nearly alone, away from the crowd of handlers and assistants and, yes, men that surrounded both of them constantly. According to this account, Elvis looked at Dean and asked him directly, "Dean, how do you keep going? How do you keep doing this night after night when you're falling apart inside?" And Dean supposedly responded with something that was both very Dean Martin and very sad. He said, "Kid, you don't. You just get better at faking it. You get better at hiding the falling apart. You get better at smiling when you want to scream. You get better at making jokes when you want to cry. Eventually, you get so good at faking it that you forget you're faking it anymore. And that's when you know you're really in trouble, because you can't even feel the real you anymore." It was a devastating admission from a man who had spent his entire career teaching the world how not to let anything get to you, how to maintain cool in all circumstances, how to float above the problems of the world with grace and humor and style. And it was in some ways a warning to Elvis. It was Dean saying in the most direct way he could, "This is where you're headed. This is what happens when you give everything and keep nothing back. This is what happens when you perform so well that nobody can tell the performance from the person anymore." Elvis didn't take that warning. He couldn't take that warning because Elvis was too far gone by that point. He was too deep into the addiction to the pills, too deep into the isolation that had become his constant companion, too deep into the need for people around him all the time who would validate him and support him and tell him that he was still the king, even as the kingdom was falling apart around him. By late 1976, Elvis's health had deteriorated to such a degree that he actually broke his ankle during one of his performances. He had to be helped through the rest of the show, but he didn't let anyone know what had happened. He kept performing. He kept going through the motions. When the Hilton management eventually found out about it, Elvis was still performing on that broken ankle every night, in pain, medicated, sweating through his jumpsuits, giving everything he had, even though everything he had was already gone. Dean Martin watched all of this from a distance. He was aware of what was happening to Elvis. He was aware of the state of the king's health, the state of his mind, the way that the machine that had made Elvis famous was consuming the person inside the machine. And Dean understood, because he was experiencing something similar. The difference was that Dean had the wisdom, or perhaps the exhaustion, to step back. Dean had learned how to say no. Dean had learned how to protect himself from the relentless demands of the entertainment industry by maintaining distance, by not caring too much, by keeping that cool facade between himself and the world. But Elvis couldn't do that. Elvis cared too much. Elvis was too invested. Elvis loved his audience too much, and himself too little, to ever master the art of distance that Dean had perfected. In December 1976, Elvis performed what would be his last engagement at the Las Vegas Hilton. He did his final show there on December 12, 1976. The show was taped, and if you watch the footage from that performance, if you listen carefully to his voice and look at the way he moves across the stage, you can hear and see a man who is barely holding on. He's talking a lot between songs, which was unusual for him. He's telling stories. He's trying to connect with the audience in a way that goes beyond the music. It's as if he's trying to use words to reach people, because the music alone isn't enough anymore. The music alone isn't carrying him through. It was during this final engagement that Elvis would have had one last opportunity to see Dean Martin in person. Whether they actually connected, whether they spoke, whether there was one final moment of understanding between them, nobody really knows for certain. The accounts are vague, the details are unclear, but the people who were close to both men seemed to believe that there was something, one final moment of connection before the end. 7 months later, on August 16, 1977, Elvis Presley was found dead in his bathroom at Graceland. He was 42 years old. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrhythmia brought on by an irregular heartbeat. But everyone knew the truth. Elvis had died because his body had finally given up. He had died because no human being can sustain that level of performance, that level of isolation, that level of drug abuse and emotional anguish for very long. He had died because the king had abdicated his throne and nobody had known what to do about it. When Dean Martin heard the news, according to accounts from people who were close to him, he went very quiet. He didn't make jokes. He didn't perform his usual defense mechanisms. He sat with the knowledge of Elvis's death in a way that seemed to strip away some of the armor that he had spent his entire life building. For the first time in a very long time, the King of Cool allowed himself to feel something without hiding it behind a smile or a joke or a drink. And then, after that moment passed, after he had allowed himself to feel that grief, Dean went back to what he did best. He went back to performing. He went back to hosting the roasts. He went back to being the man who made it all look easy, even though it had never been easy, not for a single moment of his entire life. The years that followed Elvis's death were difficult ones for Dean. He continued to work, but with less and less enthusiasm. He continued to perform, but as if he was going through a checklist. He had lost his friend, his mirror, the person who had represented to him the cost of the path that he had chosen to walk. And without Elvis as a reference point, without that living reminder of what happened to artists who didn't know how to protect themselves, Dean seemed to lose some sense of purpose. In the 1980s, Dean's son Dino, who was serving in the California Air National Guard as a fighter pilot, died in a military jet crash in the San Bernardino Mountains. The death of his son was a blow from which Dean never truly recovered. He had already been struggling with depression and alcoholism. The loss of his son seemed to push him over an edge that he had been teetering on for many years. The cool that had always been his shield, his weapon, his primary tool for moving through the world began to fail him. He was no longer able to maintain it. He was no longer able to hide what was really happening inside. By the early 90s, when Dean was diagnosed with lung cancer, he seemed almost relieved. He was offered surgery that might have prolonged his life. He refused it. He was tired. He was done. He was ready for it to be over. And on Christmas Day in 1995, nearly 18 years after Elvis had died in his bathroom at Graceland, Dean Martin died in his home in Beverly Hills, on the very day that had been his birth date in the Jewish calendar, on the day that carried special significance for him. And with his death, an era of entertainment ended, an era that had belonged to Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. and all the rest of the Rat Pack who had defined what it meant to be cool in mid-20th century America. An era that had also included Elvis Presley, who had taken that template and transformed it into something completely different. Something raw and intense and revolutionary. An era of legends, yes, but also an era of men who were paying an enormous price for their greatness. The story of Elvis and Dean Martin is a story that reminds us of something that we often forget in our admiration of greatness. It reminds us that legends are human beings. It reminds us that the most talented, the most successful, the most beloved among us are just as fragile, just as vulnerable, just as capable of suffering as anyone else. It reminds us that you can have everything the world has to offer and still feel empty. It reminds us that no amount of applause, no amount of love from millions of people can take the place of genuine human connection, genuine understanding, genuine moments where two people can drop their armor and simply be with each other, without performance, without pretense, without the weight of their own mythology pressing down on them. In the end, that's what the story of Elvis and Dean Martin is really about. It's about two men who achieved the highest levels of success that entertainment could offer, and who still, at the deepest level, were searching for something that neither of them ever quite found. It's about the hidden cost of greatness, the invisible toll that fame and success and constant performance can take on the human heart and the human soul.